ask a question this morning, and I don't want you to shout out an answer. Because somebody will shout out an answer, and then I'm going to have to say, no, that's wrong. And I don't want to embarrass anybody this morning. So, think of an answer, but don't shout out an answer. But the question I want to ask this morning is this. What is wrong with America today? Don't shout out an answer. Think about it. Here are a number of things that I think, if I was to say, shout it out, here's a number of things that I think I would hear people say. And I'm not saying I disagree with some of these things, but as I go through this morning, follow and try to understand what I'm saying. But here's a number of things that I think people would say. Abortion is one of the things that's wrong in America today. We have nearly 1 million reported abortions every year in the United States of America. That's a lot of babies that are being killed on a yearly basis. It's dropped a little bit. It's a little bit under 1 million right now, but it's very close to that. Some might say that the definition of marriage has changed. And it's been made today to be whatever people want it to be. And whoever wants to get married, for whatever reason, as long as they're in love, and as long as it makes them happy, they can pursue that. And so there are many that would say that is the problem in America today. Others might say that to go along with marriage, the divorce rate is really high. And there's no commitment. People just aren't committed the way they used to be. Some might say that pornography is one of the problems in the United States today. And I did not realize until I was looking through some things this week that the United States is the world's leading exporter of pornography today. I did not know that. I didn't think we exported a whole lot, but I didn't think that pornography was what we are known in the world for exporting out of our country. Some would say, and I haven't heard this as much lately, but some would say, euthanasia. The idea of putting to death, or at least allowing to die, those whom society says aren't worthy to be alive anymore. And so that might be something that someone would bring up. Others might bring up the idea of racism. And, looking down on different people or types of people because of their race or their background. And I couldn't pass this up. Some might say the problem in the United States today is political. And if we just had the right candidate, then our country would be fine. And there are many that are arguing that all over the United States. And I don't think, and I'm not making any kind of political statement this morning, believe me, I'm not. I don't think I've ever seen a more divided country when it comes to elections and candidates as I have in the last 6 months. Unbelievable how many enemies are made because of which candidate you may or may not choose to support. And so, many would say that part of the problem in our country today is political. And how many times have you said or heard said, if we could just return to traditional values, if we could just go back to what it was, everything in our country would be fine. The problem is our values. We might list all of those things. And I might agree that all of those things are a problem. I don't think I would disagree with any of those things as being an issue and a problem. But where I want to go with this message and over the next several weeks is this. None of those things that we listed are the problem in our country today. None of them. Not one of them is. They may be a problem, but they are not the problem. None of those things that I listed are the real issue that we need to focus on as Christians and as a church if we're going to get back to where we need to be as a nation, as a country. Those are not the real problem. They are simply symptoms of what the real problem is. I was thinking about that this week, and I thought, well, here's a personal example that I can share. Last summer, when Annette and I were, and some of you know this and some of you may not, and really I guess doesn't matter, but last summer when Annette and I were on our vacation, I got real sick. And my back broke out with a rash from neck to waistline. I was covered with a rash. And while we were away, my fever at one point was up over 103. And I spent time shaken and time in bed, and I had headaches, and my joints and my knees and that type of thing started to ache. And when we came home from vacation, or actually before we came home from vacation, I said to Annette, I really need to go to the doctor and see what's going on. And so I went down to my doctor, and they got me in very quickly and looked at my symptoms. And I thought, you know, what if my doctor had said, when I saw, it happened to be her at the time, but when I saw her, what if she had said, well, here's what we'll do. You have a rash on your back, we'll give you an ointment. And you have a high fever and your joints hurt, let's give you an anti-inflammatory, something like ibuprofen, and that'll bring your fever down and it'll make your joints feel better. And you know what? Just go home and take these things and you'll feel better. I would have felt better for a period of time. I could have put ointment on my back and it would have probably stopped it from itching. And it may or may not have cleared the ointment up, but it would have started to feel better. And if I took a lot of, anti-inflammatories of some type, my fever would have come down and probably been close to normal, and my joints wouldn't have felt bad, and it would have been easy to say, see, the problem's all taken care of. But that wouldn't have taken care of the problem. Because the problem wasn't that I had a rash and a high fever. The problem was there was something in my body that was causing those things. And so the doctor sent me for a test, and it came back that I had somewhere contracted Lyme's disease. And so she put me on medicine, not to treat the rash and the fever and the joint pain. She put me on medicine to treat the Lyme's disease. And after a period of time, the Lyme's disease was cleared up, and I haven't had any of the symptoms since. But if I had only treated the symptoms, it would have given me the false sense that I was cured, even though I wasn't cured. Even though the cause of the problem continued to be there. And as I think about that illustration, I think that the same thing is true in our culture today. The real problem isn't any of the things that we listed, although they're serious issues that need to be dealt with. But none of those are the real problem that we as Christians and that we as a church need to focus on today. The real issue that we need to focus on today is that God has been removed in many ways from our society. The real problem is that God has been taken out in many ways from our country, and in many ways even from the discussions that we have about these things. You see, so often today, when we start to discuss these social issues, what we begin to focus on is our feelings. And what we want, and what seems to help me feel good. And the issue becomes, how can we argue against those things? Because all you're telling me is that I can't love or be loved or do what I want to do in my life. But that's not the issue. The issue is God. And the issue is that God needs to be brought back into our discussions, and that God needs to be brought back into the discussion of what is right and what is wrong in our culture today. There have certainly been many that have pointed that out and understood that. A fellow, and I can't even begin to pronounce his name, a guy named, his first name is Fyodor. Any luck? I don't even know how to pronounce that. Fedor? Close. And I won't even dive into his last name because it's that long. But anyway, this fellow said this. He said, if there is no God, then everything is permitted. If there is no God, anything goes. If there's no God, there's no moral foundation. What's right and what's wrong? We can do whatever we want to do if there is no God. George Washington, one of the founders of our country, understood that. He said that reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. He's saying that there can be no national morality if God is not there. He went on to say it's impossible to rightly govern the world without God. It's impossible to rightly govern the world without God. Basically, they're all saying that if God is taken out of the equation, anything goes. Because the only foundation left is whatever seems right in our own eyes. If there is no God, then you are God. If there is no God, then I am God. And to be honest, if I'm God, I can do whatever I want to do. I can say whatever I want to say. I can act however I want to act, because it's completely up to me. And so the foundation of morality is God. The founders of our country recognized that as well. Who knows what the First Amendment to the Constitution is? The freedom of what? Among other things, the freedom of religion. The freedom of religion. And it's interesting because I hadn't done this in a while. I brought those up online and I was looking at them this week, the amendments to our Constitution. And it was something I hadn't thought of in a long time, or hadn't really taken note of, is the fact that they were all, not all of them, but at least the first number of them were adopted on the same day in history. And what I thought was interesting is the very first one was the freedom of religion, the freedom to worship God. And it's interesting to me that the Bill of Rights or the Constitution doesn't tell us who to worship, but it does bring God into the equation and makes him the foundation for all of the rest of them. If the first number of them were adopted the same day, they could have been in any order they wanted to put them in. But they didn't. They made the freedom to worship God first. Because all of the rest of them are founded on our freedom to worship God. So it's important that God be a part of our society, that God be a part of our discussions, that God be a part of our lives. I have to give credit where credit's due. I was going through some stuff that I was throwing away a couple of weeks ago. And one of the things that I was throwing away is I found in my shed an old box of books. And I thought, I don't need any of these books. And so I was getting ready to pitch them in the garbage. And for whatever reason, the book that was on top had big red letters that said God on it. And then under it says, is the issue. God is the issue. And it was written by a man that's part of Campus Crusade for Christ. His name was Brad Bright. You probably are familiar with his dad, Bill Bright, who was big into the same ministry. And so Brad had written this book. And he was the whole book is about bringing God back into the discussion, bringing God back into the argument. And what I want to do, I'm not going to preach from his book, but I'm going to use his book as a guide for the next couple of weeks to think about God being the issue. To think about God being the issue, and as Christians getting back to focusing on what the cause is, not just the symptoms in our society today. We need to focus on the symptoms. But if we don't deal with the cause, it won't do any good to focus on the symptoms. Because the cause is what is bringing out the symptoms and not the other way around. A.W. Tozer once said, it's impossible to keep our moral practices sound while the idea of God is erroneous and inadequate. Again, he's saying the same thing. That God needs to be our foundation. Nowhere do we see the truth of that revealed in the Bible more than in Judges. The book of Judges is a great example of what we've been talking about so far. Judges chapter 17 and verse 7 and Judges chapter 21 and verse 25 say the exact same thing. It says, I said verse 7, I meant verse 6 of Judges 17. He says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And at the end of the book of Judges, it says the same thing. There was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. What we see all the way through the book of the Judges is this. The people of God put God out of their lives. And as they put God out of their lives, they begin to do what is right to them. As I said earlier, very simply put, they make themselves God. When they took the foundation out of their families, the foundation out of their personal lives, and the foundation of God out of their nation, it was evidenced in all kinds of immoral behavior. It was evidenced in all kinds of immoral behavior. Here's one example, and there are many. But one example. Every time they put the true God out of their lives, they began to worship the god of Baal. And the god of Baal is a plural, really, the gods of Baal. When they began to worship Baal, they worshipped a variety of gods. And it's my understanding, from something I read some time ago, that the worship of Baal led to many immoral acts. One of the ways that they worshiped Baal is they would go to the temple of Baal. And in the temple of Baal were priests and priestesses of Baal. Well, I don't know how to say this nicely. Those priests and priestesses were prostitutes. And so what they did is they would go in and they would commit sexual immorality with the prostitutes in the temple of Baal. And that was their way to worship Baal. Another practice of the worship of Baal was the sacrifice of their children. Not all of their children, obviously, but a number of children. And so in the worship of Baal, you had families who would take their children out and offer them as a sacrifice. And they firmly believed that if I offer my child as a sacrifice, and I show no emotion for that, then Baal will bless my crops and make them prosperous and make me successful. And we say, how could somebody kill their kids? How could they stoop to that level? How could they think that sexual immorality was a means to worship God? They were doing what was right in their own eyes. God had been taken out of the picture. God was pulled out from under them. There was no worship of God. And as soon as they took God out of the equation, they did what seemed right at the time. They did what seemed right at the time. And in the book of Judges, you're familiar with this, there was this vicious cycle. There was a vicious cycle, and you see it all the way through the book of Judges. They would worship God, and then they would forget God. They would take God out of the equation of their lives. And God would give them to an ungodly nation to judge them. And that nation would come in and it would oppress them. And after a period of time, they would recognize, hey, we need God in our lives. And they would clean up their lives from all of this immorality and these things that we talked about. They'd bring God back into their lives. God would bless them and deliver them. And as long as the judge who delivered them stayed alive and taught them the things of God, they followed God. And when that judge or that king died, then they began that vicious cycle again. And as soon as God was taken out of the equation, they began to practice all kinds of immorality and sinful things. They did what was right in their own eyes. All through the book of Judges. Another example, if you turn back to Genesis chapter 18 and verse 19. Genesis 18 and 19. We see a familiar passage of Scripture here that's used often today as we think through some of these things. In Genesis 18 and 19, we're introduced to Sodom and Gomorrah. And the one that is talked about here most is the country of Sodom. In Sodom, very simply put, Sodom was known for its sexual sin. That's where we get the word sodomy today. It came out of that country. And it came out of their immoral sexual practices. In Genesis 19, in verses 4 to 7, we see a form of sexual immorality here that is often talked about and referred to when we're talking about social sins today. And it says, but before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house. They're surrounding the house of Lot. And Lot has a couple of men there who are truly angels sent from God. But they appear as men who have come into the house. And so they're getting ready to lay down, and all of the men, both young and old, all of the people of Sodom, right to the last man, it says in verse 5, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, and they said, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may know them." Now that's a sexual term. They want to know them, speaking sexually. Lot went out to the men at the entrance and shut the door after him and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have 2 daughters here who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do not to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." Now, we're familiar with that. We've read that. We've probably talked about that. There's all kinds of sexual sin that is taking place there. And the interesting thing to me, we read that and we think that, man, that's the problem with Sodom. That's it. That's not the problem with Sodom. That's a symptom of the problem at Sodom. If you go back to chapter 18, we see what the real problem is. It says, beginning in verse 22, "So the men turned and went toward Sodom. These same men that were in Lot's house spoke first to Abraham. But Abraham stood before the Lord. And Abraham drew near and said to God, 'Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked?' Abraham knows that they're going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And he says to God, 'Are you going to destroy those that are godly? Are you going to destroy the righteous?' And so God speaks to Abram here. Or Abram first says, 'Suppose there's 50 righteous in the city. Will you sweep away the place and not spare it because of the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked. So the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall you not judge all the earth? Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is right?' And the Lord said, 'If I find in Sodom 50 righteous, I will spare the whole place.' Abraham said, 'Behold, if I have undertaken to speak to the Lord, but I am dust and ashes, suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for a lack of 5? And he said, 'I will not destroy it if I find 45 there.' And Abraham spoke again and said, 'Suppose 40 are found there.' And he said, 'For the sake of 40 I will not destroy it.' And he said, 'Oh, let the Lord not be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 are found there.' And he answered, 'I will not do it if there are 30 there who are righteous.' And he said, 'What if I have undertaken to speak to the Lord? Suppose there are 20. And he answered, 'For the sake of 20 I will not destroy it.' And then he said, 'Oh Lord, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak to you but one more time. Suppose there are 10. And the Lord answered and said, 'For the sake of 10 I will not destroy it.'" What's that whole passage about? Abraham says, "God, if there are righteous people in Sodom, it would be awful for you to destroy them with the wicked." And so Abraham says, what if there's 50 righteous people there? We don't want them to die like the wicked. And so the Lord says, "Okay, if there's 50 righteous people there, I'll not destroy the whole place. I'll spare the whole city." Abraham says, "Well, what if there's 45? He says, "No, I won't destroy it for 45. What if there's 40? He works his way all the way down to 10. And God says, "Okay, Abraham, I'll tell you what. If there's 10 righteous people in Sodom, I won't destroy the whole place." What's the message of that? God was not part of the city of Sodom, because they had rejected God. And there weren't 10 righteous people in the whole city. The whole place didn't have 10. Because God said, "If there's 10, I won't destroy it." And he immediately sent his angels to Lot to say, "Get out of the city because it's going to be destroyed." There weren't 10 there that were righteous. The problem was not the sexual immorality that we read in chapter 19. The problem is there was no God in the city of Sodom. They had rejected God. They had pushed God out. And they began to do what was right in their own eyes. And the symptom is what we saw in chapter 19. The symptom was the sexual immorality. The problem, the cause, was that there was no God. God had been pushed out of the city. Would you agree or disagree today that in many ways God has been pushed out of our country? examples for an hour. But just a few. You know, and a lot of years ago now, prayer was taken out of schools. Commandments have been removed. The 10 Commandments have been removed from many public places. God, in many ways, has been removed from history books. Here's a challenge for you. If you're really brave and you're on Facebook, go home. Some of you were thinking, I'm not on Facebook. Thank God. I couldn't do that if I wanted to. Go home and put on your Facebook page, you know, I'm so thankful that I live in a country that was founded on the principles of God. I'll tell you what, you'll have an argument going in very short order. Because you will have people arguing that this country was never founded on God. God was not part of any of it. That's all a myth. I'm not saying that's a myth. But that's what people have been taught today. And there are people that have no idea that this country had a foundation and God was a part of it. And they will argue to the death that that is not true. Because God, in many ways, has been taken out of all of that stuff. He's not taught as being a part of any of those things. I thought, you know, we're coming up on graduation season. And I've been involved with a lot of graduations over the years. What is the greatest fear of high schools during graduation? Somebody will mention Jesus or God. And I have to say, Northeast is the most experience I've had with, so I can't speak to the other schools. They've done very well at some of those things in allowing that. But across the country, the school leaders today are scared to death that some young graduate is going to get up front and say, I just want to thank Jesus Christ for what he's done for me in my life. They are scared to death of that. Because there are lawsuits and those that are waiting to pounce on that. And in many ways, God has been removed from our culture and our conversation. And that, in my opinion, is the issue today. It's not all of these other things that are symptoms of that issue. And you know what I think is worse? We talked about this last week at Summit in our Bible study. You know what I think is worse? The worst way I believe that God is being removed from our church or from our culture today is that God's being removed from our churches. At least the proper understanding of God. God is mentioned in almost every church in the United States. But in many ways, it is a false God. It is a false understanding of who God is. God is removed in many ways from our churches by a wrong teaching about God and a wrong teaching of who God is. And in many ways in our culture today, in our churches today, if you don't like what is being taught about God, you go find another church. And they will teach you what you want to hear about God. And as long as we are being taught about what we want to hear about God, God's not our foundation. We are our foundation. If I only believe what I want to believe about God, He's not my God, I'm my God. And I'm picking and choosing who and what I want God to be. Here's an example. God is love. Now, is God love? Absolutely, God is love. God is the greatest love that we have ever seen and the greatest love that we have ever known. But so often today, that's taken way, way, way out of context. And you hear people say things like, we need to be more like Jesus. And we just need to love people. And I agree with that, 100%. But they go on and say, what I mean by that is, we just need to leave people alone and let them do whatever they want to do, because that's what the Bible says about love. Really? Is that what the Bible says that love is? We accept everybody as they are and encourage them to do whatever they want? That doesn't work as parents. None of us did that with our kids. They wouldn't be alive today. Because they'd have been killed in the street. Because I love my kids, I told them to get out of the road. Told them not to play with fire. I told them to change because I didn't want them to get hurt. I just read an article Thursday, Friday. And the article said that the whole problem today in our culture is that Christians just need to love people the way Jesus did. And then it said, we all know that Jesus was never hypocritical and never judgmental. Now, I would agree 100% that Jesus was not hypocritical. I agree with that. But to say that Jesus never judged anybody? Really? Did you read the New Testament? Before you made a statement like that, did you read the Bible? I agree Jesus was never hypocritical. Jesus never told people one thing and then did something else. But to say that Jesus never judged? Here's a couple of passages of Scripture. Read Luke chapter 11. While Jesus was speaking, a Pharisee asked him to dine with him. So Jesus went in and reclined at the table. The Pharisee was astonished to see that he did not first wash before dinner. And the Lord said to him, "Now, you Pharisees cleanse the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness." Wait a minute. Is that judgmental? Jesus said, "You fools! You fools! Did not he who made the outside make the inside also? But give as alms those things that are within, and behold, everything is clean for you. But woe to you Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and every herb, and neglect justice and the love of God. Those you ought to have done without neglecting others. Woe to you Pharisees, for you love the best seat in the synagogue and the greetings in the marketplaces. Woe to you, for you are like unmarked graves, and people walk over them without knowing it." Jesus said to the Pharisees, "You're like graves that people walk on." That's judgmental. Jesus is judging them. And then in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus is sending out his disciples into the world. And he says, "If anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake the dust off your feet and leave that house or town. Truly I say to you, it will be more tolerable or more bearable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town." Not judgmental. Matthew 25. Then he will say, speaking of the day of judgment, then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you cursed, into everlasting or eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels." I thought, Jesus loved people more than anyone ever loved people. And he calls us to do the same. He came to seek and to save sinners. And yet Jesus did not accept people just as they were and tell them to go on and do whatever you want and I'll continue to love you anyway. He never did that. He loved them enough to tell them they needed to change and point them in the way of truth. People often refer to Jesus' interaction with the adulterous woman whom they caught in adultery and said to stone. And Jesus writes on the ground and says, "Whoever's without sin cast the first stone." And they stop there and they say, see, Jesus loved her as an adulterous woman. And he did. Which is why he said, "Go and sin no more." He didn't just accept her as she was. He pointed her in the way of truth. And as Christians, we need to begin with God, and we need to point people in the way of truth. In many ways today, the church has made Jesus a pansy who stood for nothing and stood up against nothing and allowed culture to do whatever it seemed right. And that is not the Jesus of the Bible. He loved, absolutely he loved. He loved enough to point people to the truth. He loved enough to point people to God. And you and I today as Christians need to love in the same way. We need to accept people so that we can point them to the truth. We can point them to the foundation of God in their lives. And the first step to doing that is to understand that the social issues that we stand against today are simply symptoms. They're not the cause. And over the next couple of weeks, we're going to talk about how to bring God back into the argument. How to bring God back into the discussion so that we can deal with the cause and not the symptoms that we see in our society today. Let's take a moment and bow for prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we do thank you today for Jesus Christ. We thank you for the love that he loved that the world had never seen before. A love that was true and genuine. And yet a love that, while accepting of people of all types, a love that never just accepted them and told them to continue on as they were. A love that brought them in, built their lives on the foundation of faith in Jesus Christ, and changed them, and made them who and what was right and acceptable to you. Lord, we live today in a culture that is struggling. They may or may not recognize it, and they may or may not admit it. But we live in a culture today that is struggling with legitimate needs that they are trying to find the answer to in other forms. And they're falling short. And Lord, help us to be able to bring you, God, back into the discussion. To deal with the problem and not just the symptoms today. And Lord, give us courage and wisdom and strength as we pursue over the next several weeks how to accomplish that in our lives and in our culture. We thank you in Jesus' name.